Some places along this ragged western coast don't scream their horrors. They whisper them, soft as fog sliding in at dusk, soft as a mother's lullaby drifting across black water. The Pacific has patient hands and an older memory than any of us care to admit. Hands that can cradle a dying ship or gently stroke the cheek of a keeper standing watch on a lonely rock. Out here, the wind rarely howls. It sighs instead. The waves rarely crash. They murmur secrets against the cliffs. And the lighthouses don't merely guide sailors home. They remember every soul they failed to save, every voice that never quite made it back to shore. Listen close on a still night, when the beam sweeps slow and steady across the dark. You might catch it. A faint sound that shouldn't be there. A movement where nothing should move. Or a voice calling across the water that refuses to fade with the wind. The ocean is never in a hurry. It doesn't need to shout. It only needs one quiet moment of weakness. And then, ever so gently, it pulls you under. Welcome to Hushwarden Horrors, where silence tells the darkest stories. The first time Hank McDermott heard the knocking, he thought the Pacific was finally coming to finish the job it started the day his son drowned. It was January 1948, the kind of winter that made even the supply boat captains from Astoria cross themselves before they left the dock. Terrible Tillamook Rock Lighthouse sat 1.25 miles off the Oregon coast, like a rotten tooth knocked loose in a bar fight. 133 feet of black basalt straight up from the surf. No beach, no harbor, just a sheer fist of rock the sea had been punching for 10,000 years. The lighthouse tower rose another 62 feet on top of that, iron and stone and stubbornness. Keepers called it the worst station on the West Coast. Hank had called it salvation when the Coast Guard offered him the winter contract. 3 months alone, double pay, and no one asking why a 42-year-old ex-Navy signalman with a dead boy and a wife who wouldn't speak to him anymore wanted to live on a rock that hated people. He'd been on Tilly 6 weeks when the storm hit. Routine until then. Wind 40 knots. Barometer falling. Lamp trimmed and turning. He wrote it all down in the big leather log like a good little monk. The Fresnel lens, 12 feet tall, 5 tons of glass and brass, swept its beam across the black water every 10 seconds, the same way it had since 1881. Hank slept in 4-hour shifts, ate canned peaches and hardtack, and tried not to think about the way Mikey's life jacket had looked, bobbing empty in the Strait of Juan de Fuca 3 years earlier. Then the wind went from scream to howl, and the howl learned rhythm. He was in the watchroom at the base of the tower, oiling the clockwork that drove the lens, when the first knock came. 3 measured raps, like knuckles on iron. Not the random hammer of storm debris, not the groan of the tower swaying on its bolts. This was deliberate. Someone at the lantern room door, 120 feet above him, knocking like they wanted to be let in for coffee. Hank froze, rag in hand. The sound cut straight through the roar. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. Then silence, except for the sea trying to eat the rock. He told himself it was the wind playing tricks. He'd heard keepers go mad out here. One man in 1929 had walked off the gallery rail screaming about mermaids. Another had set the log on fire and tried to row home in a dinghy during a gale. Hank wasn't going to be that man. He climbed the spiral stairs anyway, boots ringing on iron, one hand on the rope because the whole tower was breathing now, flexing like a rib cage. The lantern room was a glass cathedral whipped by rain. The Fresnel lens turned slow and majestic, throwing its white blade across the chaos outside. The iron door to the narrow gallery was dogged shut. Hank stood there, heart kicking, and listened. He put his palm flat on the cold metal. The knocking stopped the instant he touched it, as if whatever was out there had been waiting for exactly that. He undogged the door. The wind tried to rip his arm off. Rain came sideways, needles of it. He stepped onto the gallery, 18 inches wide, no railing worth a damn, and the beam swept past him, lighting nothing but vertical water and the black teeth of the rock below. No bird could have clung there in this. No man. No ledge big enough for a gull to shit on. Just slick stone dropping straight into the surf that boiled white 80 feet down. He stood there until his face went numb, then dogged the door again and went back down. In the log he wrote 2340, unusual knocking at lantern door during force 10. Investigated. Nothing found. Barometer 29.42 and falling. He didn't write that the knocking had started again the second his back was turned on the stairs. It happened every night after that, always when he wasn't looking. Always 3 measured knocks, then 3 more, always at the lantern room door. He tried staying up there for hours, facing the door, coffee long cold in the tin cup. The moment he turned to check the wick or wind the mechanism, 3 knocks. He spun back. Nothing. He began to time it, 11 seconds after he looked away, like clockwork, like it was learning him. By the 3rd week he was sleeping in the lantern room, curled on the iron grating with a blanket and a shotgun he wasn't supposed to have. The light swept over him every 10 seconds, painting his face corpse white, then shadow black. He talked to it sometimes. "Come on, then," he'd mutter. "Show yourself, you son of a bitch." The sea answered with waves that exploded against the rock so hard the tower rang like a bell. He started seeing things in the beam. Not every night. Just when the wind dropped for a breath and the rain thinned. A shape on the rock face below the gallery. Not climbing, there was nothing to climb. Just there, hunched against the stone like it had always been part of it. Pale, long, human enough to make his stomach fold in on itself. Then the beam moved on, and it was gone. He told himself it was a trick of the lens, a reflection, a dead seal. But seals don't stand upright on vertical rock in 100-mile-an-hour gusts. February came in like a knife. The supply boat couldn't make the run. Hank's last fresh food was a single onion he'd been saving. He ate it raw while the knocking kept perfect time with his chewing. That was the night he found the other log. He'd been rummaging in the storage cupboard under the stairs for spare mantles when he dragged out a small, water-stained ledger he'd never noticed before. The cover was stamped 1931. He opened it under the lantern and read by the turning beam. The handwriting started neat. Then it changed. January 14th. Knocking at lantern door. Investigated. Nothing. January 17th. Same. Occurs only when I turn away. 11 seconds. January 22nd. Saw it tonight. It has my son's face. Hank's hands started to shake so hard the pages rattled. The last entry was dated February 3rd, 1931. It doesn't want the light. It wants company. I'm going out to talk to it. If you find this, tell Mary I'm sorry. The keeper's name had been Charles Becker. Hank remembered the story now, how Becker had simply vanished during a storm. Boat came, found the light burning, the log open, no body. They figured he'd been swept off the rock. Now Hank knew better. He closed the book and looked up at the iron door above him. 3 knocks, soft as a secret. He climbed the stairs slower than he ever had. The shotgun was in his hands, shells in his coat pocket. The tower swayed like a drunk. At the top, he didn't bother with the door. He just stood in the lantern room and waited, facing the glass, back to the iron. 11 seconds. The knocks came from behind him, inside the room now, on the iron frame of the lens housing. 3. Like something standing right at his shoulder. Hank spun. The lens kept turning. The beam swept across the room, and for one frozen second, it lit up a face pressed against the outside of the glass. Not on the gallery, not on the rock. Pressed flat against the curved panes 60 feet above the surf, as if gravity had forgotten it existed. The face was white and bloated, like something dredged from the bottom. Water streamed from its hair. Its eyes were wide and patient and full of something that might have been love if love had drowned 3 years ago and kept swimming. It had Mikey's face. Exactly. The same gap-toothed grin the boy had the day they took the skiff out. The same cowlick that never stayed down. Hank screamed. The shotgun went off by accident, blowing a hole in the ceiling. Glass rained down. The face didn't flinch. It smiled wider, and the knocking started again. Inside the room, on the floor, on the walls, on the underside of the iron grating beneath Hank's boots. Everywhere at once. He ran, down the spiral, boots slipping, shoulders slamming the wall. The knocking chased him, faster now, like it had learned to run too. He burst into the watchroom and slammed the heavy oak door, through the bolt. The sound followed him through the wood. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. Polite. Patient. Hank sat with his back to the door, shotgun across his knees, and cried for the first time since the funeral. The next 3 days were a blur of storm and no sleep. He wrote in the log until his hand cramped. It has my boy's face. It wants me to open the door. It knocked on the inside of the cupboard today while I was eating. Heard Mikey laughing in the cistern. He stopped writing after that. The words started appearing anyway. In his handwriting, but he didn't remember writing them. Come outside, Dad. The water's warm. He tore the pages out and burned them in the stove. The ashes spelled his son's name before they crumbled. On the last night, the storm reached its peak. The barometer bottomed out at 28.90. The tower shook so hard the lens rattled in its frame. Hank stood at the bottom of the stairs with the shotgun and a lantern, every light in the place burning. He was done hiding. "Come on, you bastard," he whispered. "Let's finish it." He climbed. The knocking met him halfway, traveling down the iron rail like Morse code. When he reached the lantern room, the door was already open. Rain poured in. The beam swept across the empty gallery. Hank stepped outside. The wind tried to peel him off the rock like a barnacle. He gripped the iron railing with both hands, shotgun slung over his shoulder. Below him, the Pacific was a cauldron of white. And there, 50 feet down the sheer face, clinging to nothing, was the thing that wore his son's face. It looked up. The beam caught it full on. The eyes were black holes now, bottomless, and behind them, something ancient looked out. Something that had been watching sailors since men first built boats. Something that had waited under Tilly long before the lighthouse, long before the rock even had a name. It had learned patience from the tide. It had learned hunger from shipwrecks. And it had learned loneliness from every keeper who ever stood this watch. It raised one hand, too long, fingers jointed wrong, and knocked 3 times on the stone. The sound traveled up the rock and into Hank's bones like a promise. Mikey's voice, small and sweet, floated up through the gale. "Daddy, I'm cold. Come swim with me." Hank's legs moved before his brain caught up. One step toward the edge, then another. The railing pressed against his thighs. The drop sang to him. He was crying again, but he was smiling too, because for the first time in 3 years, the ache in his chest felt like it might finally stop. The thing below opened its arms. Hank lifted one foot. The beam swept past again, and in that white glare, he saw what was really waiting down there. Not his son, not even the bloated thing with the borrowed face. Dozens of them, clinging to the rock like pale barnacles all the way down to the surf. Keepers in rotting oilskins, fishermen with hooks still in their jaws, women in nightgowns, hair streaming upward as if they were already underwater. All of them knocking in perfect unison now, 3 and 3 and 3, the sound rising like a heartbeat. They had been watching the whole time. Hank screamed and threw himself backward. He hit the gallery floor hard enough to crack a rib. The shotgun clattered away. The door slammed shut by itself, iron dogs sliding home with a sound like teeth. Inside the lantern room, the knocking stopped. Total silence, except for the wind and the sea and Hank's own sobbing. He crawled to the logbook, hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the pen. He wrote the final entry in big, careful letters, so whoever came next would understand. It isn't knocking to get in. It's knocking to get out. Tell them not to send another keeper. Tell them to let the light go dark. He closed the book. Outside, something began to climb the tower. Not fast, not loud, just the slow, wet scrape of hands on stone, rising floor by floor, pausing at each window like it was reading the log through the glass. Hank sat with his back to the lens housing and listened to it come. He never opened the door again. When the supply boat finally fought its way through the gale 3 days later, the light was still turning. The tower was undamaged. Inside, they found the lantern room spotless, the mechanism wound, the Fresnel lens gleaming. The logbook lay open on the watchroom table. The last page was blank, except for 3 small, wet handprints, perfectly spaced, like a child had leaned over to see what Daddy wrote. Hank McDermott was never seen again. But sometimes, on the worst winter nights, when the wind drops for just a second and the beam sweeps across the black rock, fishermen passing Tilly swear they see a man standing on the gallery rail. tall, still, watching the water. He always has his back to the light, and if you listen close, closer than you should, you can hear it. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. Coming from inside the tower now, waiting for the next keeper. The sea is patient, and terrible Tilly always needs a watcher. The first time Captain Frank Callahan saw the lifeboat rowing itself through the fog, he did what any sane man would do. He laughed, because the Pacific had finally told its funniest joke. It was late October 1952, and the Columbia Bar was living up to every ugly name the old fishermen gave it. They called it the Graveyard of the Pacific, for good reason. This was where the Columbia River met the ocean in a permanent bar brawl. Sandbars that shifted like drunks, sneaker waves that could swallow a freighter whole, currents strong enough to rip the keel off a destroyer. Over 2,000 ships had died here. Bodies rarely came back. The sea kept what it took. Callahan was 47, a thick-shouldered Irishman from Astoria, with 23 years in the Coast Guard, a failed marriage, and a habit of talking to the wheel like it could talk back. He commanded the cutter Resolute, doing a night patrol after a 3-day gale that had kept every fishing boat in port. The fog that night was the worst kind, thick, wet, and personal. It pressed against the bridge windows like something trying to get in. The foghorn moaned every 90 seconds, low and lonely, the sound of a man who already knew he was lost. Callahan stood on the starboard bridge wing with binoculars, coffee long gone cold in his mug. The radar was painting nothing but smears. Then the lookout, a kid barely old enough to shave, yelled, "Boat! Dead ahead, 1 point off starboard." Callahan raised the glasses. There it was, sliding out of the soup maybe 200 yards away. A white wooden lifeboat, paint still bright, riding perfectly upright. The oars rose and fell in slow, perfect rhythm. Dip, pull, lift, like they were being worked by invisible clockwork. No sail, no engine, no crew, just that steady, purposeful rowing against a current that should have been spinning the boat like a leaf. Callahan let out a short bark of laughter. "Some kid's goddamn prank," he muttered. "Stole it from the Maritime Museum and got turned around in the fog." He ordered the Resolute to close. The cutter's engines throbbed. The lifeboat didn't speed up or slow down. It kept its perfect line, heading northwest, straight into the open Pacific, like it had somewhere important to be. They got within 50 yards, close enough for Callahan to read the stenciled black letters on the transom. Lifeboat number 5. The laugh died in his throat so fast it hurt. Everyone on the Columbia knew the story of the SS Valencia. January 1906. The passenger steamer slammed into the rocks off Vancouver Island in a winter storm. 136 souls lost. Lifeboats had been launched into chaos. Most sank or were smashed. Lifeboat number 5 was officially recorded as lost with all hands. 23 men, women, and children crammed aboard when the ship started breaking up. No wreckage ever found, no bodies, just gone, swallowed by the graveyard. Yet here it was, 46 years later, looking like it had rolled off the builder's yard yesterday. The oars kept moving, water streaming off the blades in silver threads. Callahan grabbed the bullhorn, voice steady out of pure habit. "Ahoy! Lifeboat number 5, United States Coast Guard. Heave to and identify." The oars never missed a beat. He tried again, louder. Nothing. No heads turned, no voices answered. The fog ate his words and gave back only the soft creak of oarlocks and the gentle splash of blades. "Bring us alongside," Callahan ordered, jaw tight. The Resolute eased closer. 20 yards. 10. Callahan could see details now. The coiled lines, the empty thwarts, the faint gleam of brass. The boat rode the chop without rocking, perfectly balanced, as if the sea itself was holding it steady. Then it simply wasn't there. 1 second it was 10 yards off the port bow. The next, the fog closed in and the space was empty water. No splash, no wake, just gone. The bridge went dead quiet. Someone behind Callahan whispered, "Sweet Jesus." Callahan lowered the binoculars. His hands were steady, but inside something cold had uncoiled and started crawling up his spine. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The sea had just shown him something it wasn't supposed to show. He wrote it up in the log as possible fog refraction anomaly. But that night, alone in his cabin, he couldn't stop seeing the oars moving by themselves. The sightings multiplied after that. First, it was the fishermen out of Warrenton and Ilwaco, old salts who'd seen every trick the bar could play. They described the same thing, a white lifeboat emerging from the fog, rowing steady, never rocking, always on that same northwest heading. Always Lifeboat number 5, always empty, and always vanishing the moment anyone tried to close the distance or follow. Then the Coast Guard Auxiliary started reporting it. A crabber named Tomas Ruiz swore the boat passed within 20 feet of his rig at dawn one morning, close enough that he smelled wet wood and something worse underneath, like old blood left too long in a dark bilge. He shouted. The oars kept pulling. When he tried to follow, the boat melted into the fog like it had never been real. Portland didn't like it. Unexplained sightings in the graveyard made headquarters nervous. They sent the Resolute out again with firm orders. Investigate, intercept if possible, and put the damn ghost story to bed. Callahan took her out on a night when the bar was unnaturally calm. The sea had that oily, waiting look, like it was holding its breath. Fog lay low and thick. The crew was quiet. Even the engines sounded muffled, as if the fog was pressing sound down into the water. Callahan stood on the bridge with a fresh thermos of coffee, thinking about his ex-wife, about how she used to say the sea had married him first, and there wasn't room for her. He was thinking about the way Lifeboat number 5 had looked. Too clean, too purposeful, like it had been waiting for an audience. At 2:17, the radar pinged something small and solid, dead ahead. "Same bearing," the radar man said, voice tight. "Moving at 3 knots, course 280. Callahan ordered lights and the bullhorn again. The lifeboat appeared exactly where the radar promised, closer this time, 30 yards. The oars rose and fell with that same hypnotic rhythm. Dip, pull, lift. Callahan could see more now. A child's red scarf snagged on one thwart. A woman's shoe wedged under the stern seat. Things that had no business still being there after nearly half a century at sea. He raised the bullhorn. "Lifeboat number 5, "This is the Coast Guard. Stop your oars and prepare to be boarded." For the first time, the oars hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. Then they resumed, but slower, almost like they were listening. Callahan felt his pulse kick hard. He motioned to the boarding party. Mateo Delgado, the bosun's mate, a tough Filipino-American with 15 years on the water. Young Everett Kane, the Kansas ensign who still looked like he belonged on a college football field. And a couple of deckhands. The Resolute nosed closer. 10 yards. 5. The lifeboat was right there. Callahan could have stepped across. He saw the grain in the wood, the faint dark stains on the floorboards that might have been rust or might have been something that had soaked in deep and never dried. Delgado tossed the grapnel. It flew clean and caught the gunwale with a solid thunk. For one heartbeat, the night held still. Then the lifeboat jerked violently, as if something enormous on the other end had yanked the line. The grapnel rope snapped taut. Delgado nearly went over the rail. The Resolute heeled sharply to port. Men shouted. The lifeboat didn't capsize or slow. It simply accelerated, towing the heavy steel cutter for 10 impossible yards before the line parted with a crack like a rifle shot. The lifeboat shot forward into the fog, oars now pulling hard and fast, and vanished. But not before they all saw the faces. They rose just above the gunwales, pale, water-bloated, eyes wide and exhausted. A woman with long black hair streaming like seaweed. A man in a sodden officer's uniform, skull crushed on one side. A little girl clutching a doll whose porcelain face was cracked. They didn't scream or reach out. They simply looked at the Resolute with the quiet, patient stare of people who had been rowing for decades and still hadn't reached the shore they were promised. The fog swallowed them whole. Delgado stood at the rail, shaking, teeth chattering in the cold. "Captain," they were looking right at me, like they wanted me to come with them. Callahan said nothing. He went below and poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon with hands that refused to stop trembling. That was when the dreams began. Not just for Callahan, for the whole crew. They dreamed of the Valencia breaking apart in the dark, rockets climbing into the storm, women and children screaming as the ship listed hard and the sea poured in. They dreamed of being crammed into lifeboat number 5, the boat dropping into waves taller than houses. They dreamed of oars that could never stop moving, because stopping meant the sea would claim them for good. They dreamed of the cold that got inside your bones and never left, of salt water in the lungs, of the way the fog tasted like every lost soul who had ever gone down on the bar. Callahan woke every night with the taste of brine in his mouth and the sound of oars in his ears. He started keeping a second logbook, a small notebook hidden in his locker, away from the official records. November 12th. Saw it again at 3:40, closer this time. Heard a child crying, not the wind, not gulls. A child. November 19th. Delgado found small wet footprints on the deck this morning, leading from the rail straight to the center of the boat, then stopping. No one admits to walking there barefoot. November 25th. Bar was dead calm. Heard oars all around the ship for 20 minutes. Not on radar, not visual, just the sound. Dip, pull, lift. The crew began to fray at the edges. Everett Kane, the young ensign, started refusing night watches. Said he could feel eyes on him from the water. Tomas Ruiz, the cook who had once been a crabber and claimed the first close sighting, found a child's shoe in the galley one morning. Same style as the one they'd seen in the lifeboat. He threw it overboard. It came back the next day, tangled in the kelp they hauled up in the nets. Delgado took to sleeping with a small crucifix under his pillow and stopped joking with the men. Callahan tried to get them relief. He radioed Portland, asked for a temporary stand-down, said the crew was showing clear signs of stress and fatigue. Headquarters told him the bar was always tricky. Fog played tricks on everyone, and to keep the lights burning, Captain. He started going out alone in the small inflatable at dusk, against every regulation in the book. Just him, a flashlight, and his service 45. He would drift in the patches of water where the sightings had been thickest, and wait, listening. On the night of December 3rd, the fog was so thick he couldn't see his own hands on the tiller. He killed the outboard and let the inflatable drift on the glassy water. He heard the oars first. Dip, pull, lift, coming straight toward him. Callahan switched on the flashlight and swept the beam across the black water. The lifeboat was 10 feet away, bow on. The oars moved with mechanical precision. Around the handles he could see the faint shimmer of hands, translucent, blue-white, not quite solid, like memory given just enough strength to keep working. The faces rose again. Closer now. The little girl with the cracked doll looked straight at him. Her lips moved. No sound came, but he understood anyway. We're still trying to get home. Callahan's throat went dry. Where's home? He whispered into the fog. The girl pointed northwest, toward the open sea, toward the broken bones of the Valencia, still lying on the rocks far to the north. One of the men, a sailor with half his face missing, reached out a hand. The gesture was almost kind. Come with us, Captain. It's easier when you're not rowing alone. Callahan felt it then. The pull. Not the physical tug of current, but something deeper. The same pull that had kept him at sea long after his marriage collapsed. The same pull that made men stay on the water, even when the water clearly didn't want them. The sea doesn't just take bodies. It takes the hollow places inside you and fills them with salt water and endless longing. He raised the 45 and fired 3 shots into the bottom of the lifeboat. The bullets passed straight through. No holes, no splash. The oars never even faltered. The lifeboat began to circle him slowly, patient. The faces watched with that same tired patience. Callahan started the outboard with shaking hands and ran full throttle back to the Resolute. Behind him, the oars kept perfect time, fading but never quite gone. Back on the cutter, he found the entire crew on deck, staring into the fog. They had all heard the shots. They had all heard the oars circling the ship for the last 10 minutes. That night, the dreams turned vicious. Callahan dreamed he was in the lifeboat, not rescuing, not observing. One of them. His own hands were on the oars, pulling, while the Valencia burned and listed behind him, and the sea rose up to swallow the screams. He dreamed he could never stop rowing, because stopping meant admitting they had all been dead since 1906. He dreamed the fog was stitched together from every soul the graveyard had ever taken, and they were all rowing now, an endless convoy of ghost boats heading nowhere. He woke screaming. Delgado found him on the bridge at 4 in the morning, standing at the wheel with his eyes open, but not seeing anything in this world. "Captain," Delgado said quietly, "we need to go in. The men, they're talking about walking off when we tie up." Callahan turned. His eyes were bloodshot. "You hear it, don't you? The oars. They never stop." Delgado nodded slowly. "Every night now. Sometimes in the day, if the fog's thick." Callahan gave a cracked laugh. "They're not lost. They know exactly where they're going. They're looking for more oarsmen. The graveyard needs crews. The boats need rowers. Forever." He refused to bring the Resolute back to Astoria. Instead, he kept her on station, patrolling the same deadly stretch where the lifeboat appeared most often. The crew grew quieter. Some stopped speaking entirely. One deckhand tried to jump overboard at first light. They pulled him back, but he kept whispering that the little girl had called his name in his sleep. On the night of December 17th, the bar turned ugly without warning. A freak squall roared in out of nowhere, wind howling, waves stacking like angry black hills. The Resolute fought hard, but the sea felt personal now. Every wave slammed the hull like it knew the ship's name and hated it. Callahan was on the bridge when the radar suddenly lit up. Not one contact. Dozens. Small. Moving in tight formation. All heading straight for the cutter. The lookout screamed. Out of the driving rain and spray came the lifeboat. Not alone this time. Behind it, faint but unmistakable, other boats followed. Shadows of other lifeboats, some from the Valencia, some older, square-rigged longboats, even what looked like an ancient dugout. All rowing. All empty on top, but crowded below with the patient, waterlogged dead. Lifeboat number 5 pulled ahead, oars flashing. It came straight for the Resolute's port side. Callahan grabbed the wheel himself. "Hard starboard!" It was too late. The lifeboat didn't collide. It passed straight through the steel hull like smoke. For one freezing moment, Callahan felt the cold. Not air temperature, the deep, bone-crushing cold of the bottom, the cold of lungs full of brine. He felt hands, dozens of them, grabbing at his ankles, his coat, his wrists. Gentle, insistent. "Come on, Captain. We've been rowing so long. We need someone strong to take a turn at the oars." He heard the little girl's voice, clearly this time, right beside his ear, soft and sweet. "Daddy, it's cold out here." Callahan had no children, never had, but the sea didn't care about the details. He fought, he screamed and swung at empty air. The crew saw their captain battling nothing while the cutter heeled dangerously in the squall. Delgado and 2 others tackled him, dragged him below, and strapped him to a bunk. Callahan kept thrashing, shouting that the boat was inside the ship now, that the dead were walking the passageways, looking for warm bodies to replace the ones that had grown too cold and tired. The squall passed as suddenly as it had arrived. When they unstrapped him at dawn, Callahan was calm. Too calm. His face had the peaceful, distant look of a man who had finally made a decision. He walked up to the bridge, poured himself coffee, and stared out at the flat, gray sea. "They're not trying to drown us," he told Delgado quietly. "They're recruiting. The graveyard needs crews that never quit. The boats need rowers who can't die." Delgado didn't argue anymore. That afternoon, Callahan ordered the Resolute to head for the exact coordinates where the Valencia had first broken up. Farther north, but the bar's memory was long, and it reached that far. The crew protested. He overruled them. He was still the captain. They never reached those coordinates. At 1900, the fog returned, thicker than anything they had ever seen. The radar died. Compasses spun wildly. The engines coughed, sputtered, and died despite full tanks. And out of the whiteness came the sound of oars. Hundreds of them. A fleet. The lifeboat appeared off the starboard beam, so close they could have touched it. This time the faces weren't pleading. They were expectant, welcoming, like old shipmates who had been waiting for one more hand on the oars. Callahan stepped onto the open deck without a life jacket. He looked at his crew, men he had sailed with for years, and gave them the saddest smile any of them had ever seen. "I kept you boys out here too long," he said. "Time to go home." Before anyone could move, Callahan climbed over the rail and dropped into the lifeboat. He landed lightly. The boat steadied itself beneath him as if it had been waiting for exactly his weight. There was an open space on the center thwart. Callahan sat down, took the oars in his big, calloused hands, and began to row. The crew shouted. They threw lines. They somehow got the engine started again. Maybe the sea allowed it for just long enough to make the moment crueler. It didn't matter. The lifeboat pulled away smoothly, Callahan rowing in perfect time with the invisible others. His face was calm, almost relieved. The fog began to swallow the boat. Just before it disappeared completely, Callahan turned and looked back at the Resolute one last time. He raised one hand in a slow, deliberate wave. Then he was gone. The Resolute limped back to Astoria 3 days later with a skeleton crew and stories no one in Portland wanted to hear. Mateo Delgado was the only one who would speak about it afterward, and even he eventually stopped. He retired early, moved to the desert in Nevada, said he couldn't stand the sight or smell of fog anymore. The official report was simple. Captain Frank Callahan lost at sea during heavy weather. Presumed swept overboard. No body recovered. But the fishermen still see the lifeboat. Sometimes it rows alone. Sometimes it leads the others. And every so often, when the fog lies thick and the Columbia Bar is feeling especially mean, you'll spot a new rower in lifeboat number 5. Broad-shouldered man, graying hair, rowing with the steady, tireless rhythm of someone who has finally found the only crew that will never leave him. He never looks back at the cutters or the fishing boats that try to follow. He just rows. Because the graveyard of the Pacific is never short of wrecks. And every wreck needs a lifeboat, especially the ones that never quite make it all the way to shore. The sea is very, very patient, and some boats never stop rowing. The first scream tore through the gale like a living thing that refused to be silenced by the wind. It was March 1954, and Heceta Head Lighthouse clung to the jagged Oregon coast like a stubborn candle against the dark. 205 feet above the Pacific, its white tower and red-roofed keeper's house looked postcard pretty by daylight. At night, when the fog swallowed the beam and the cliffs dropped straight into black water, beauty curdled into something watchful and hungry. The locals said the headland had a long memory and short mercy. Walt Hendry had taken the head keeper's post that winter because silence was the only thing that still felt honest. His wife had died 2 years earlier on a rain-slick curve of Highway 101, and the emptiness inside him matched the emptiness of the rock. He was 44, quiet, methodical, the kind of man who logged every barometric drop and every trimmed wick without complaint. His 2 assistants were Owen Blake, a lanky 24-year-old from Portland who still thought lighthouse duty sounded romantic, and Tomas Ruiz, the older cook and handyman who had come over from a Coast Guard cutter that had seen too many unexplained things on the Columbia Bar. The 3 of them kept the big 4-ton Fresnel lens turning, fought the salt corrosion, and tried to pretend the cliffs below didn't bend sound the wrong way. The scream arrived on a night when the wind was already howling loud enough to drown out God. Hendry was alone in the lantern room at the top of the tower, wiping salt haze from the curved glass panes with a soft rag. The Fresnel lens rotated slow and majestic, throwing its white blade across the rain-lashed cliffs every 10 seconds. The storm battered the iron gallery railing outside like it wanted in. Then, cutting straight through the roar, came a woman's voice, high, ragged, desperate. "Emily!" It wasn't carried on the wind. It sliced through it. Clear. Close. Right beneath the lantern room. Hendry froze. The beam swept past, lighting nothing but vertical rain and the sheer basalt drop to the surf 200 feet below. No trail reached that section of cliff. The only path down started half a mile north and ended at a treacherous cove the fishermen called Devil's Punch Bowl. No sane person would be out there after dark. He waited, rag dripping in his hand. The wind screamed on. Then the voice returned, louder, climbing. "Emily! Where are you, baby?" It rose against every law of physics, dragging itself up the rock face from the waterline, past the keeper's house, straight toward the tower. Not fading with distance, not scattered by gusts. Searching, intent. Hendry stepped onto the narrow gallery. Rain needled his face. He leaned over the railing and shouted into the void. "Who's down there? Identify yourself!" The only answer was another cry, almost directly below him now. "Emily!" It sounded as if the woman stood on the gallery beside him, yet the sweeping beam revealed only empty stone and boiling white water far below. Hendry backed inside, dogged the iron door, and descended the spiral stairs fast, boots ringing on metal. His pulse thudded in his ears, the way it had the night the trooper brought his wife's wedding ring in a plastic bag. In the watchroom, he found Owen Blake standing rigid by the radio, face drained of color. "You heard it?" Hendry asked. Blake nodded once. It was right behind me on the stairs. When I turned, nothing was there. Tomas Ruiz appeared from the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on a towel. His voice was low and tired. It started again. I heard the same pattern on the cutter. Voices that don't belong to anything, still breathing. Hendry didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in what his own ears reported. He sat at the logbook and wrote with careful, steady strokes. March 14th, 1954. 23:50. Strong northwest gale, force 9. Unusual vocalizations from base of cliffs. Female voice calling for Emily. Sound ascended cliff face against wind direction. Investigated gallery and stairs. Nothing found. He didn't add that the screaming had followed him down the tower, staying exactly 11 steps behind the whole way, like it was learning the rhythm of his boots. It happened every night after that. Always the same terrible ladder of sound. The cries began at the waterline around 2300, when the tide was highest and the surf hammered the rocks hardest. Then they climbed, slow, deliberate, stage by stage, up the sheer cliffs, past the keeper's quarters, up the spiral stairs, until they reached the lantern room. Never random noise, never scattered by the storm, always searching with purpose. Emily, Emily, baby, answer mommy. Sometimes there were fragments of pleading between the screams. I told you not to go near the edge. Please, sweetheart, mommy's coming. Other times it was pure animal grief, raw, wet, endless. The men developed small, desperate rituals to hold the dread at bay. Hendry stayed in the lantern room as long as possible, back pressed to the lens housing, facing the glass. Owen Blake slept with the shortwave radio blaring static. Tomas Ruiz muttered old prayers in Spanish while he stirred pots of beans and salt pork, his knife never far from reach. They dug through the old logs during the day. Entries went back to 1894, when the light was first kindled. One keeper in 1927 had written, "The cries reached the lantern room tonight, not from outside, from inside the stairwell, as if something is retracing a path it was never allowed to finish." Another, undated, in handwriting that grew shakier toward the bottom. "It is not a woman. It is the memory of one, and the memory is still looking." Local stories tried to make it neat. They said a young mother had lost her daughter to the surf sometime in the 1880s, before the lighthouse existed. The little girl wandered too close to the edge during a storm. The mother climbed down after her, screaming the child's name until the sea took them both. The girl's body was never recovered. The mother washed ashore 3 days later, eyes wide, mouth still frozen mid-cry. But the logs didn't care about pretty legends. The logs spoke of pattern, of intent, of something that refused to accept the end of its search and kept climbing against gravity, against wind, against time itself. By the end of the second week, the screams had grown bolder. They learned the keepers' names. "Walt! Walt, have you seen my Emily?" Hendry was alone in the oil room one gray afternoon, refilling the reservoir by lamplight, when the voice drifted up the spiral stairs, soft, almost neighborly. "Walt, is she up there with you?" The heavy can slipped from his hands. Oil splashed across the stone floor. When he looked down the stairs, there was only shadow and the faint glow of the lower lamp. That night, the screams climbed faster than ever. They didn't stop at the gallery door. They came through the iron, through the glass, wrapping around the turning Fresnel lens like cold fingers. "Emily, Emily, please! Mommy can't find you." Hendry stood rigid, shotgun across his knees, the one he wasn't supposed to keep on station. The beam swept out, flashing the cliffs white. In one stuttering instant, he thought he saw movement far below, a pale shape climbing the vertical rock. Not hands and feet, more like the memory of climbing. Then the light moved on, and the cliff was empty again. Owen Blake began seeing things when the beam swept the cove at low tide. A small figure in a soaked nightdress, standing perfectly still while waves crashed around her ankles. She never looked up at the light. She simply waited. Tomas Ruiz found small, wet footprints in the kitchen one morning, child-sized. They led from the back door to the middle of the room and stopped, as if the girl had stood there looking for something to eat. The dread built, small wrongnesses piling like dry kindling until the spark found the whole pile. A giggle in the cistern. A lullaby hummed off-key from inside the wood stove. The sound of bare feet pattering up the stairs just after midnight, always stopping 11 steps behind whoever was climbing. They tried to escape the pattern. Hendry radioed headquarters requesting relief, citing severe auditory hallucinations, possibly caused by isolation and storm exposure. The reply was blunt. Winter staffing was stretched thin. The light had to remain operational. Hold your post, keeper. So they held. One windless night in early April, the Pacific went unnaturally flat, reflecting the lighthouse beam like a black mirror. The sudden silence felt worse than any gale. The 3 men gathered in the watchroom, drinking coffee that tasted of metal and fear. That was when the screams started at the waterline and climbed with new speed. "Emily!" Up the cliffs. "Emily, baby!" Past the keeper's house. "Walt! Owen! Tomas! Have you seen her?" The voice was inside the tower now, not echoing down the stairwell, coming from every direction at once, from the walls, the floorboards, the inside of their skulls. Owen Blake shot to his feet so fast his chair clattered over. "It knows our names! How the hell does it know our names?" Tomas Ruiz crossed himself. "Because it has been watching us the same way it watched the mother. It needs fresh searchers to finish the climb." Hendry gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles whitened. "We do not answer. We stay together. We keep the light turning. That's all." But the light felt tainted now. Every sweep of the beam across the cliffs made the screams swell, as if the lens itself was feeding whatever lived in the rock. At 2:30, the screams reached the lantern room again. This time they didn't knock politely at the door. Hendry was alone at the top. The other 2 were trying to sleep below. He heard the iron gallery door rattle, though it was dogged tight. Then the sound of small, bare feet on the grating. Patter, patter, circling the lens housing behind him. He raised the shotgun. "Who's there?" A child's giggle answered, sweet and wet. "Mommy's coming. She's almost here." Hendry spun. Nothing but turning brass and glass. The giggles moved, now from the stairwell, now from the ceiling beams, now from inside the Fresnel lens like the glass had swallowed a little girl whole. Then the mother's voice returned, inches from his ear, raw with terrible hope. "Emily, I see you. Mommy sees you." The entire tower began to tremble, not from wind, but from something heavy climbing the outside wall. Wet scraping sounds, hands on stone, rising floor by floor. It passed the watchroom level, then the oil room, then the service landing. Slow, patient, retracing the path it had been denied in life. Hendry backed against the lens as the gallery door bowed inward, iron groaning under impossible pressure. "Open the door, Walt," the mother whispered, almost tenderly. "She's up here with you. I can hear her breathing." Hendry's finger tightened on the trigger. "There's no one here but me." A lie. He felt the child now, a small, cold presence brushing his leg like a cat seeking warmth. He smelled wet wool and deep seawater. The door swung open by itself. Rain poured in. The beams swept across the empty gallery, but it wasn't empty. A woman stood on the narrow railing, nightdress plastered to her body, hair streaming upward as though the wind blew from the sea below. Her face was the color of drowned bone. Her eyes were hollows that had looked too long into the dark and kept looking. She wasn't watching Hendry. She stared past him into the lantern room, at something only she could see. "Emily," she breathed, voice cracking with awful joy. "There you are." Hendry turned. The little girl stood in the center of the room, barefoot on the iron grating, nightdress dripping. She looked up at her mother with wide, patient eyes. "Mommy," she said softly, "I waited so long." The mother stepped off the railing and drifted forward, arms open, feet never touching the floor. Hendry fired both barrels of the shotgun straight into the space between them. The blast was deafening. Glass shattered. The sound should have torn the night apart. The woman and child didn't flinch. The pellets passed through them like smoke. They simply kept moving toward each other, mother and daughter, finally meeting after 70 years apart. The little girl smiled at Hendry as she walked into her mother's arms. "Thank you for keeping the light on," she whispered, "so we could find each other." The two figures merged, not gently, hungrily. The mother's form swelled, absorbing the child, growing taller and darker until it filled half the lantern room. The face that turned toward Hendry was no longer human. Mouth stretched too wide, too many eyes, all of them still searching. It opened that terrible mouth and screamed. Not for Emily anymore. For him. "Walt, come help me look." Hendry dropped the empty shotgun and ran. He took the spiral stairs 3 at a time, boots slipping, shoulders slamming the wall. Behind him, the merged thing flowed downward like spilled ink, not chasing fast, but inevitable. The screams filled the tower, mother, child, and something older that had nested in the cliffs long before either of them. He burst into the watchroom, where Owen Blake and Tomas Ruiz were already on their feet, eyes wide with animal terror. "It's inside," Hendry shouted. "Both of them! Joined, now!" They barricaded the door with tables and chairs, But it made no difference. The screams were already in the room, circling, probing for the weakest heart. Owen Blake broke first. He lunged for the outside door, yelling that the little girl was calling him, that he had to go down to the beach. Tomas Ruiz tackled the younger man, but Blake fought like someone drowning, clawing at the older man's face. Hendry tried to help, but the voice was inside his own head now, soft and coaxing. "Walt, your wife is down there on the rocks. She's waiting with Emily. Don't you want to see her again?" In that moment he saw her, his dead wife standing on the cliff edge below, waving up at the light. She looked exactly as she had the morning they buried her, smiling, beckoning. The hollow place inside him ached with sudden, treacherous hope. He shook his head violently. "She's gone. She's gone." But the cliffs showed him what lonely men secretly crave. One more chance. The dopamine of horror climbed higher, small doubts twisting into cravings, cravings into need. The sea knew exactly how to fill the empty spaces. Tomas Ruiz was praying louder, but his voice cracked when the little girl's giggle floated from inside the cold iron stove. Owen Blake broke free and ran out into the night. They heard his footsteps pounding down the path toward the cliffs, then a short, surprised scream as the edge crumbled beneath him. Silence. Hendry and Ruiz stood back to back in the watchroom, breathing hard. "We have to keep the light going," Hendry said. "If the light dies, it wins everything." But the light was failing. The Fresnel lens had taken on a sickly greenish cast, fractures spiderwebbing across the prisms. Every rotation sounded like bones grinding together. At 4 o'clock, the screams stopped abruptly. The silence pressed down like a physical weight. Then a new sound began. Small, bare feet climbing the stairs. Pat, pat, pat. Accompanied by a soft, off-key lullaby hummed through waterlogged lungs. Hendry grabbed the last spare mantles and a can of oil. Up. We relight what we can. We do not stop. They climbed together. The lantern room was wreckage. Glass shattered, brass dented, but the mechanism still turned somehow. The merged thing waited in the center, wearing the layered faces of mother and child like a bad double exposure. It smiled with too many mouths. "Stay with us," it said in a voice that was both woman and girl. "The light is so pretty up here. We can all look for the ones we lost." Tomas Ruiz dropped to his knees, sobbing. Hendry hauled him back up. They worked frantically, trimming broken wicks, pouring oil with shaking hands, while the thing watched with patient hunger. The beam swept out again, weak, flickering, but still cutting the dark. For a moment, the screams quieted, as if satisfied by the offering. Then they returned, changed, not searching, inviting. "Walt, Tomas, come down to the water. Your families are waiting. It's warm down there. No more climbing." Hendry felt the pull deep in his chest, the same hollow his wife had left. The sea offered to fill it. All he had to do was walk the path, step off the edge, and let the surf finish what it started decades ago. Tomas Ruiz stared toward the window, eyes glassy. "I can see my mother. She's waving from the beach." Hendry slapped him hard across the face. "Fight it! The light has to stay on." but the lens was dying. Cracks spread with audible pops. Each sweep grew dimmer. At 5:30, the first gray hint of dawn touched the horizon. The thing in the lantern room let out one final, ear-splitting shriek that shattered the last intact panes. It surged forward, wrapping both men in cold, wet arms that smelled of deep brine and endless grief. Hendry felt himself lifted. He saw Tomas Ruiz's face inches away, eyes already peaceful with surrender. In desperation, Hendry lunged for the emergency flare gun on the wall. With bloody fingers, he loaded it and fired straight into the heart of the creature. The flare burst in brilliant red light. The thing howled and recoiled, dropping them both to the grating. Tomas Ruiz did not move again. His eyes stared at something only he could see, a small smile frozen on his lips. Hendry crawled to the mechanism. With the last of his strength, he wound it one final time, forcing the cracked lens to turn. The beam swept out, faint, stuttering, but still there. Dawn strengthened. The pale figures on the cliffs began to sink back into the rock like mist burning away. The screams retreated step by step down the tower, back to the waterline where they belonged. Hendry sat against the lens housing, holding Tomas Ruiz's cold hand, and watched the sun rise over the Pacific. He wrote the final entry in the log later that morning, after the relief boat fought its way through the swells and found him alone in the shattered lantern room. The screams have stopped for now, but they will return with the next keeper. They always climb. They always search. Do not send anyone who has lost someone. The light attracts what it cannot save, and whatever you do, do not answer when it calls your name. Walt Hendry was taken off the rock that afternoon. He never returned to lighthouse service. He lived out his remaining years in a small inland house near Eugene, windows kept shut even in summer heat. Neighbors said he never went near the ocean again, because sometimes the wind still carried voices that bent and dragged the wrong way. But on the worst stormy nights, if you stand on the cliffs below Heceta Head, when the lighthouse beam sweeps across the dark, you can still hear it. A woman's raw cry, a child's wet giggle, rising from the surf, climbing the cliffs, searching. The headland does not echo the way it should. It remembers, and some paths are never permitted to end. If these quiet tales from the western coast have left you listening a little too closely to the wind tonight, if you find yourself wondering what else might be climbing those cliffs or rowing through the fog, then perhaps the sea has already begun its gentle work on you. If you enjoyed sinking into these stories, do me a favor and leave a like. Subscribe to Hush Warden Horrors so you never miss the next whisper from the dark. Turn on notifications, because out here, the worst things never announce themselves loudly. Until the next still night, sleep well. Just remember, the Pacific is very patient, and it's always listening for your name.